Trade imbalances are not simply the result of differences in technology or productivity. They often stem from disparities in income distribution within each society, where workers and retirees are forced to spend far less than they deserve, while assets accumulate in the hands of those who already have more than enough. This passage comes from a book that looks at the global economy in a completely different way from how we usually think about international economics. Instead of discussing tariffs or exchange rates as dry tools, the book delves into something rarely acknowledged: the silent battle over power and interests within each nation. It tells the story of China, where most of the gains from reform were funneled to enterprises and local governments, forcing hundreds of millions of households to tighten their belts to support exports. It tells the story of Germany, where labor reforms gave people jobs but kept wages low, suppressing domestic purchasing power so that excess production could flow out into the world. And it tells the story of the United States, a country that seems to enjoy the privilege of the dollar but in reality bears the burden of debt, job losses, and financial bubbles because it is forced to absorb the world's excess. Reading these pages feels like walking down a long hallway, where each door opens to another paradox. Why does a country with a large trade surplus make its own people feel poorer? Why is the world's most celebrated strong currency tied to the weakening of the domestic middle class? And why do factories close in Ohio while savings pile up in Beijing or Berlin? The book does not promise easy answers. It forces readers to confront an uncomfortable reality: global trade is not a fair competition between nations. It is the direct consequence of distribution choices within each society. Domestic inequality becomes surplus on the international balance sheet, then reflects back as crises elsewhere. The question it raises is the spark for discussion: if the root lies in inequality, can tariffs, trade agreements, or "my country first" slogans really solve anything? Or are we treating symptoms while the root cause continues to crack wider? Before diving into the full review of the book, we encourage listeners to buy and read it to fully experience the content. Only by reading the entire book will you truly understand the issues being discussed here. Please buy the book and support the authors. Now, let's begin the review together. Long ago, when trade was slow and expensive, the world economy resembled a small village market where everything had to be transported by wind, horse, or human power. In that cramped space, a Scottish scholar stepped in, observed a small pin factory where hands divided tasks to create something seemingly trivial. By breaking down labor, productivity multiplied enormously. From that tiny image, he recognized a great law: humanity grows rich not by doing everything, but by letting go and specializing in what it does best, then exchanging the rest. That story opened an era of theory. But half a century later, a wealthy British financier who grew rich through bold bets discovered another paradox. He proved that even if one country does everything better than another, trade can still benefit both sides, as long as each focuses on its comparative advantage. His example was simple: Portugal makes wine better than England, and cloth better too. But if Portugal specializes in wine and England in cloth, both become richer than if they tried to do everything. Yet theory often looks good only on paper. That rich Englishman lived in an era when capital flowed poorly across borders, news traveled slower than a galloping horse. He could not imagine a world where product components circled dozens of countries before reaching consumers. In his mind, nations were still large households trading finished goods, not fragments of value chains. Across the ocean, a young revolution had just succeeded in a fragile new nation surrounded by enemies and lacking industry. A young statesman with sharp vision understood that relying solely on agriculture would keep the country dependent forever. He wrote a long report proposing tariff barriers to nurture infant industries. To him, protection was not just for businesses but to safeguard newfound independence. That voice contrasted sharply with the praise of free trade on the other side of the Atlantic. Years later, a German exile in America witnessed the powerful rise of industry there and learned the lesson. He realized free trade is not always the path to prosperity. For weak nations, it is like opening the door for giants to swallow the small. Only when strength is comparable can equality be discussed. From America to Europe, protectionist ideas ignited a flame that changed the course of the century. Then the world entered a tense phase. From the 1870s, major powers raced to build tariff walls, protect domestic markets, and expand colonies. Global trade shrank relative to the economy as political and military power merged with economics, creating closed trading blocks for goods, capital, and people. Movement was not just for profit but under orders of guns and flags. It did not stop there. 2 world wars erupted, shattering fragile exchanges. When the guns fell silent, humanity had to rebuild a new order. International agreements and conferences set rules so trade would no longer cause disaster. A new monetary system emerged, along with multilateral trade agreements. But even with changed political will, another barrier remained: transport costs. Ships were cumbersome, loading took weeks or months, ports congested with weary workers. Trade might be free of tariffs but was still bound by material costs, too expensive to ship goods halfway around the world. The world seemed open, but the door was only slightly ajar. Then a simple invention changed everything. Those crude steel boxes, seemingly lifeless, carried revolutionary power. When goods were packed into containers, everything aligned like gears in a giant machine, from ports to trucks, railcars to warehouses. Loading time dropped from days to hours, costs plummeted, and trade exploded. People began envisioning a world where production no longer fit within borders. A product could be conceived in one place, assembled in another, with components from dozens of countries. No longer one country selling wine to another selling cloth. Now fragments of a phone, car, or computer cross oceans multiple times before taking final form. If Adam Smith or Ricardo returned, they would be astonished to see the division of labor far exceeding their imaginations. Hamilton and List, who believed in protection's power, might have to admit that power now lies with global supply chains controlled by multinational corporations. From dark pin workshops to bright assembly lines, from 18th-century philosophers' desks to today's tech giants' boardrooms, the history of trade has come full circle, always revolving around one question: who truly benefits from this exchange? In the second half of the 20th century, the world faced another turning point. War left ruins but also opportunities for a new economic order. International conferences, multilateral agreements, and new organizations arose to prevent old catastrophes. Trade needed rules to avoid becoming a source of conflict. But goods still moved heavily and slowly. The problem was logistics. Unloading a ship could take a week, paying hundreds or thousands of workers. Costs inflated prices many times over. In that deadlock, the container appeared as a universal language for global trade: uniform steel blocks stackable on trucks, trains, and ships. Its simplicity unleashed an explosion. Production chains rearranged, components from a Japanese factory, through Korean lines, German technology, then final assembly in China. Products labeled "Made in China" actually contain effort, intelligence, and value added from half a dozen countries. The new world of trade is no longer one nation selling to another. It is a tangled network where the boundary between export and import blurs. A car with a Hungarian engine, Mexican transmission, American software. A phone designed in California but assembled in Southeast Asia with Japanese technology. The price for this complexity is distorted official statistics. Goods crossing multiple borders have value counted and recounted, making the international trade picture warped. Governments think they have deficits with one country and surpluses with another, but much value is created at intermediate points. Truth hides in seemingly transparent numbers. More importantly, power shifted. Trade was once a story of nations and governments, now it lies with transnational corporations, entities with power beyond borders. They control supply chains, decide where to produce, hire cheap labor, place factories for tax incentives. They, not politicians, rewrite trade rules. Looking back, from Adam Smith's pins to Ricardo's wine and cloth, Hamilton and List's protectionism, all revolve around allocating resources and capturing benefits. But entering the 21st century, with giant container ships carrying millions of tons, the question becomes: who controls this network, and who is left behind? The truth reveals a paradox. The world thought free trade brings prosperity to all, but not everyone can enjoy the fruits. Some societies consume far less than they produce, forcing surplus outward. Others consume more than they create, borrowing and importing to maintain living standards. When those imbalances accumulate enough, they turn into political tensions, even conflict. From 18th-century pin workshops to iPhone assembly lines, trade's journey is one of power of ideas, policies, capital, and now invisible networks connecting continents. No one can stand outside this game. Every departing container carries not just goods but the fate of workers, economies, and relations between nations. That cycle teaches one thing: trade has never been just buying and selling. It is always a mirror reflecting what happens deep within societies: inequality, ambition, and fear. Looking at stacked containers on ships, we see not just cargo but undercurrents waiting to erupt. People often think trade causes currency issues, but looking deeper into history's waves, everything flows the opposite way. Whenever capital surges across borders, trade bends to follow, whether buyers or sellers want it or not. Money goes first, goods follow. Take 19th-century London, when the central bank loosened policy and gold flowed out, credit markets widened. America across the Atlantic boomed, agricultural production surged, projects sprang up, land prices soared. But when London tightened and pulled gold back, that prosperity froze, houses abandoned, projects unfinished, workers unemployed. A nation's seemingly independent boom-bust cycles were tied to the breathing of a financial center halfway around the world. Many U.S. crises originated not from cornfields or small factories but from gold shortages in Bank of England vaults. This made free trade ideas fragile. Not because Americans could not produce or sell, but because credit doors opened or closed from afar. Researchers began recognizing a familiar pattern: international credit waves like tides rising from the center, crashing on peripheral economies' shores. When water recedes, ships are left stranded and fragile on the beach. Time and again, young economies swayed to rhythms they did not control. Into the 20th century, a new financial world emerged. From the 1950s, something called eurodollars appeared, dollars held outside U.S. territory in European banks to avoid regulation. Those floating dollars became the lifeblood of a new system where credit expanded quickly and widely. Inflation in the 1960s and 1970s added tension. While U.S. banks faced interest rate limits, money market funds emerged, attracting depositors with higher returns. Capital escaped the official system into unofficial channels, then recirculated globally. A dollar could multiply into endless credit layers like infinite mirrors. Then came the oil shock, energy prices soared, pouring dollars into exporting countries' pockets. But those countries could not spend it all domestically. Surplus capital flowed to European and Japanese banks, then onward to Latin America, the Soviet bloc, even the most closed economies. This was called petrodollar recycling, a massive experiment where real money fueled growth in distant lands. For a moment, the world thought it had found the formula for infinite prosperity: capital flows out, another economy swells, global trade blooms. But behind the growth numbers lay fragile dependence. No one asked what would happen when flows reversed. The world reached a turning point. In Washington, a seemingly technical decision caused an earthquake. Monetary policy tightened to unprecedented levels. Real interest rates soared, becoming unbearable burdens for prior borrowers. Former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt bitterly said these rates were the highest since Jesus Christ was born. The domino effect followed: commodity prices collapsed, raw material exporters lost revenue to service debt, while borrowing costs multiplied. Debts once symbols of modernization became nooses. In August 1982, Mexico declared it could no longer service its debt on time. This was not just one default but an alarm bell worldwide. Mexico triggered a chain: one country after another fell into crisis from South America to Africa. What had been praised as a global credit miracle revealed itself as a fragile system. A sneeze from the center was enough to topple the periphery. In those years, a harsh truth emerged: trade did not collapse from lack of goods or unwilling consumers but from financial arteries being squeezed when capital stopped flowing. Ships sat idle in ports, warehouses full but no one coming. The 1970s prosperity turned out to be borrowed prosperity. One could blame Mexican or Argentine governments for overborrowing, but looking closely, they were links in a cycle. Petrodollars from oil flowed to European banks, then to developing economies, then back as interest payments to the center. When flows went smoothly, everyone felt rich. When reversed, all were sucked into the whirlpool. That lesson repeated many times in history. Trade tensions cannot be understood by looking only at products and services. Behind every shipment are loans, capital flows, financial commitments binding entire nations. When capital is blocked, trade balances shift automatically, regardless of domestic desires. From cornfields in Iowa to copper mines in Chile, from 19th-century London banks to 20th-century eurodollar markets, the story holds one rule: capital flows determine trade's fate. Seemingly invisible credit contracts and interest rates control millions of workers, thousands of ships, and nation stability. If anyone still believes global trade is just free exchange of goods, remember 1982. That was when truth was laid bare. Trade wars are surface phenomena. Deeper battles over finance decide who enjoys prosperity and who bears crisis. In the global economic picture, there is a seemingly dry formula that operates like a natural law. A society's trade surplus or deficit mirrors the gap between its savings and investment. Imagine a small community. If people save more than they can use domestically on projects, the excess must seek outlets abroad. Conversely, if the village craves more roads, schools, factories but lacks savings, it imports capital and goods, accepting deficits with the rest of the world. Seen this way, trade is no longer just swapping rice for steel or clothes for oil. It becomes a flow connecting savings heart to investment's pulse. Depending on context, that flow can nurture prosperity or sow instability. Sometimes imbalances bring good things. Aging societies with shrinking populations and limited opportunities save much but have nowhere to invest domestically. Surpluses become a way to send excess to younger, ambitious lands building bridges, factories, power grids. Deficits are not weakness but a phase needing imported capital and technology to break out. Forcing self-sufficiency traps them in poverty cycles. History records tragic examples of isolated self-reliant countries paying with generations of hardship. But the same formula can become injustice's source. Imagine a society where most wealth concentrates in a small group's hands, far exceeding consumption needs. They cannot and do not want to spend it all. Excess turns into forced savings piling in banks, then flowing abroad. Meanwhile, most workers, who should buy goods to sustain domestic demand, lack ability to pay. Result: excess savings on one side, deficient consumption on the other. Domestic production finds no market, forced outward as surpluses. On the opposite side, societies produce less than consumption desires. Instead of admitting distribution problems, they borrow to fill gaps. Deficits become debt traps. Households borrow to maintain living standards they could afford if income were distributed fairly. Here savings and investment reveal their paradoxical face. A society can grow rich via surpluses but make most citizens poorer. Another grows via deficits but lays foundations for future financial crises. Those statistics, savings, investment, deficits, surpluses, are actually very human stories: who gets to spend, who must tighten belts, who bears debt, who accumulates assets. Seen this way, international trade is no longer nations' playground but direct result of domestic income distribution decisions. Inequality within one country not only distorts domestic markets but pushes the world into surplus-deficit vortices. That is the thread connecting distant workers to global stock prices. Looking closer, we see two distinct paths for societal development, one based on high savings, the other on high wages. Both have logic, but social consequences differ vastly. High savings models often start with sacrifice. Governments or elites use power to retain most income, limit consumption, channel resources to investment projects. People spend less, living standards lag productivity. Production exceeds domestic demand, forced outward, resulting in surpluses. If investments are wise, infrastructure, education, technology, society advances long-term. But it comes with paradox: the nation is seen as successful while most citizens feel left behind. This is primitive trickle-down growth. Fruits accumulate at the top and drip slowly down. High-wage models choose differently, raise workers' income. Domestic demand explodes, consumption exceeds current production, forcing imports. Deficits in this phase are not weakness but the price of attracting foreign capital and technology. Inward investment exploits new consumer markets, expanding domestic capacity. The accounting identity shows it clearly: production equals consumption plus investment plus exports, imports. In other words, deficits can fuel modernization if society turns imported capital and technology into internal strength. Both models involve trade-offs. One suppresses present for future accumulation, the other accepts deficits to expand capacity. No path is completely safe, but both lead to one common point: savings and investment stories cannot separate from income distribution. History witnessed this in its harshest form. In 1920s America, returns concentrated upward. Most people could not buy enough to absorb rising output. To maintain living standards, they borrowed. Household debt swelled, creating fake prosperity until the system collapsed. The glamorous years were built on financial leverage. The mechanism repeated in many places and eras. When inequality grows too large and a small group holds most wealth, economies become fragile. Excess savings of the few must find outlets abroad, while the rest borrow or are pushed out of markets. Trade imbalances arise not from natural development needs but domestic distortions. From there we understand deficits or surpluses are not just statistics, they echo distribution decisions and accumulated silent inequalities. A society can be praised for world market success, but if workers, farmers, and poor are left behind, that success is built on sand. Another may appear weak with deficit numbers, but behind it lies investment in a fairer, more sustainable future. Viewing international trade in this light, we no longer see soulless numbers. We see faces, life stories, ties between classes. Surpluses and deficits are surface, true depth lies in who decides society's income share and uses that power to shape countless fates. After late 1980s political upheavals, a vast country had to rebalance control and growth. Opening reforms improved material lives for hundreds of millions. But hidden in spectacular growth figures was a hard paradox: household consumption's share of output kept falling. Incomes rose, but prosperity feeling did not match because spending decisions shifted from people to investment and production. Into the 1990s, new policies deepened that shift. Financial, fiscal, and labor markets were designed to force savings. Wages and pensions compressed while production received more resources. This was not just economic choice but survival strategy for a regime recovering from trust crisis. In 1994, a major devaluation changed the board. The currency fell from 5.8 to 8.7 per dollar, then held nearly fixed for over a decade. The currency stayed artificially low relative to real production power, creating artificial export advantages. Goods flooded the world, but workers' real incomes eroded. They worked more, produced more, but held less, reflecting sweat and effort. The 1997 to 1998 Asian financial crisis hardened this strategy. Neighbors collapsed under fleeing foreign capital. The country clung to the peg. Stability became priority, even sacrificing domestic consumption. People became shields, bearing fallout to avoid Indonesia or Thailand-style chaos. In under 15 years, the country flipped from deficit to giant surplus. By 2005, surpluses reached 6% of output, peaking in 2007 to 2008 near 10%. Numbers astonished the world, but few saw roots: silent wealth transfer from hundreds of millions of households to factories, corporations, and national forex reserves. The central bank became a dollar-collecting machine. Private sectors blocked from sending money out, all incoming foreign currency funneled to official reserves. Trillions piled in vaults while farmers lost land to industrial zones, workers received bare subsistence wages. It was a strange transformation. Nation enriched rapidly, but many families felt poorer. Environmental costs accepted as part of formula, land seized cheaply, air and rivers sacrificed for speed. Local governments saw surpluses and investment as achievements, daily injustices sidelined from reports. Household consumption relative to economy hit rock bottom in 2010, lower than any major economy recorded. Surpluses then not just clever policy results but mirror of a society accepting hundreds of millions tightening belts for international strength. After 2007 to 2008 peak, global financial crisis hit. Nominal surpluses shrank from about $420 billion in 2008 to less than half later. Many thought imbalances resolved, but structure told different story. Manufacturing surpluses actually larger than before. Difference on import side, in 2000s, huge machinery and manufactured imports served domestic consumption and investment. Post-2008, trend reversed, imports for domestic needs fell from 23% of output to under 10%. This does not mean people suddenly consumed fewer computers, phones, or cars. It reflects indigenization and import substitution policies, supply chains pulled home, self-producing what once bought abroad. Change made surpluses appear smaller externally, but essence remained, country exporting most created wealth. Manufacturing nurtured by exchange rate and credit support grew globally competitive. Household demand still suppressed by distribution and regulations. To maintain stability, huge foreign currency continued flowing to central bank, reserves reaching trillions, but reserves cannot sit idle. They exported outward as infrastructure investment, credit, contracts under global projects. The Belt and Road Initiative became way to absorb excess, turning it into diplomatic tool and influence expansion. People witnessed new paradox, wealth they created, instead of becoming domestic schools, hospitals, safety nets, became high-speed rail in Africa, ports in Southeast Asia, power plants in South Asia. Nation reached outward, but domestic rich-poor gap quietly widened. Researchers repeatedly stressed only sustainable escape, shift assets and income from state, local governments, state enterprises to households. That means land reform, HUQ adjustment, stronger unions, fairer taxes. Without it, economy relies on debt to sustain speed. When debt ceilings hit, imbalance cycles return. From Tiananmen to Belt and Road, 3 decades show truth. Trade surpluses not inevitable product of talent or diligence but distribution decisions within society. Each container carries not just goods but silent sacrifices of millions domestically. Until structure changes, even if paper surpluses shrink, inequality and instability waves remain, ready to rise anytime. In 1989, Berlin Wall fell. For many, symbol of freedom. For Germany, door to unprecedented socio-economic experiment. 2 halves, one steeped in market economy for decades, other under central planning, now joined. Unifying currency, authorities chose 1:1 East-West mark rate. Symbolic decision carried huge destructive power. East German labor costs suddenly higher than West's, while productivity far lower. Within 2 years, 2/3 of East industry collapsed, factories closed, lines dismantled, workers jobless. Over 6% of East population migrated west for opportunity. Truehand agency tasked with restructuring and privatizing state firms became FI-sale symbol. Thousands of companies dissolved or sold symbolically. State bore huge losses, communities once industry-dependent left with empty shells. After initial shock, growth stalled 1991 to 1997. Europe's largest economy averaged 1.3% annual growth, weakest since 1950s. Press called Germany sick man of Europe. Industrial powerhouse pride turned to insecurity. Reunification not only halved output but shifted social power. Once strong unions weakened. Collective agreement coverage fell from over 80% mid-1990s to under 45% today. Collective voice faded. Tax and welfare policies favored high earners, wealth gaps between homeowners and renters swelled. Central bank noted oddity, national savings rose, but not from everyone saving more. Over a quarter of increase came from income shifting to low-spending accumulators. Rich got richer, household purchasing power weakened in shops. All created paradox, reunified nation needing strong consumption to heal instead saw people tighten spending. Domestic demand insufficient, excess production sought external outlets. Seeds of long-term trade surpluses sown from domestic social cracks. After turbulent years, Germany entered new century with reforms called dry reports and plans but with wide family impacts. Core philosophy: more jobs at lower wages. Once proud welfare system shortened and tightened. Unemployment benefits once lasting years now limited to 12 months for most under 55, then minimal support with strict conditions. Flexible, part-time, temporary contracts spread. Workers had little choice, except low-wage jobs or marginalization. Policies achieved paper goals, unemployment fell, jobs rose, but at cost of compressed wage structure. Economic growth did not translate to better living for majority but accumulated in small capital-owning group. National savings rose mainly from those already wealthy. Household consumption stayed weak, not reflecting Europe's largest economy's potential. When domestic absorption insufficient, surpluses inevitably flowed outward. Pre-2008, German capital flooded South Europe, financing property and consumption booms in Spain, Greece, Portugal. Those nations seemed richer but borrowed future. When bubbles burst, debt crises hit, German banks bore huge losses. Post-crisis, paradox deepened. Once deficit countries forced austerity, cutting public to private spending, reducing imports. They shifted from deficit to surplus not via superior development but suppressing own people. Eurozone under strong German influence became mega external surplus bloc, about 4% of area output pushed outward for rest of world to absorb. Domestically, government pursued iron fiscal discipline. From 2014, Finance Ministry proudly announced no new borrowing, black zero, budget surpluses reaching 2% of output. While infrastructure decayed, internet lagged, public projects delayed. Balanced budget became self-goal overriding future investment needs. All led Germany to strange position: production powerhouse, paper-rich but weak household purchasing power, lagging infrastructure, swollen external surpluses. Path different from China's but destination similar, distribution conflicts compressing domestic consumption, forcing excess outward. Prolonged surpluses become burden on other economies and source of international conflict. But deeper view shows not product of superior productivity but political and social choices. Who tightens belts? Who accumulates? Who bears costs? The dollar always praised as global hegemony's crown. But behind glory lies burden few want to face squarely. When world seeks safety in dollar assets, America forced to become giant issuer of obligations. From late 1990s to mid-2008, foreign central banks and reserve funds amassed over $4 trillion in U.S. assets. America had to produce mountains of bonds and commitments, not from domestic need but to absorb rest-of-world excess savings. Pressure extended beyond finance into daily lives of millions. Inward international capital should raise domestic rates for balance, but instead rates fell below 2% mid-2000s. Current account deficit swelled to nearly 6% of output, paradox: larger deficits, cheaper rates. Not sign of trustworthy cheap borrowing but forced acceptance of foreign capital regardless of real need. Boost kept dollar high. Cheap imports flooded shelves, domestic production uncompetitive. Steel, textile, furniture factories closed gradually. In direct competition zones, workers lost jobs or accepted low wages. But living needs persisted, household credit exploded to fill gap. Borrowing became condition for maintaining standards. Banks replaced unions, credit cards replaced wage increases. Suburban streets filled with houses bought on easy loans. Prices soared, creating fake wealth feeling. Many thought advancing but slid on thin ice. Simple truth: housing bubble not from domestic demand but international pressure forcing America to supply safe assets. Houses became disguised bonds for rest of world. Every time dollar praised as ultimate reserve currency, remember privilege carries trade-off. America forced to run deficits, supply financial assets globally. Price: domestic jobs eroded. From Midwest abandoned factories to debt-laden households, story traces to same cause: dollar's special position. Not medal but yoke. When world seeks dollar safety, American people bear burden. They consume on credit, produce deficits, accept industrial base erosion to maintain global order. Paradox, strong currency nurturing vulnerable economy is expensive burden few acknowledge. After housing bubble burst and 2008 global financial crisis spread, many thought system would self-correct, US deficits shrink, domestic production recover. But reality opposite, deficits hovered around 2 to 3% annually like unhealing wound. Per capita consumption never returned to pre-crisis trend, still 12% below. Housing investment never recovered mid-2000s levels. Public investment halved. Manufacturing output until 2018 still below 2008 peak. Manufactured goods deficit exceeded 4% of output, deepest since 19th century. Another push from Europe post-2014, ECB quantitative easing sent euro savings flooding out. US Treasuries alone absorbed $800 billion. Unlike pre-2008, money not recirculated back. Dollar rose 20%, crushing US exports while imports surged. America again forced to bear other spending shortfall. Underlying, global safe asset shortage. Surplus countries and global rich keep buying dollar bonds for liquidity and trust. Harsh truth, every time they find safety in bonds, American people pay with job losses, trade deficits, piled debt. There was alternative. Instead of households borrowing and housing bubbles, federal government could borrow and spend directly on infrastructure, education, reindustrialization. External deficits persist, global capital needs haven, but domestic structure different, sustainable jobs for workers, modern transport in cities, less fragile society. But path not chosen. Private credit and financial market loosening continued substituting policy. Result, familiar vortex, household debt rises, assets inflate again, economy more vulnerable to next shock. Looking at Europe, similar script different actors. Post-2010, austerity imposed widely. People forced to cut spending when needed most. Wages compressed, welfare shrunk, household purchasing power rose only half as fast as output. Eurozone became huge surplus bloc, but price was a sacrifice generation. Global imbalances once centered on China now shift toward Europe. Truth, surplus is not proof of superior productivity. They signal income withdrawn from spenders and piled on accumulators. Rich richer, firms excess, but society loses natural consumption driver. Excess finds no domestic outlet, pushed abroad. If surplus nations want to escape cycle, hardest step needed, return wealth to workers, retirees, consumption-capable groups. Means land reform, taxes, unions, removing invisible barriers holding power in few hands. Only then economy relies on real domestic demand instead of exporting surpluses for others, especially America, to bear. Short-term paths, increase federal spending, expand central bank dollar swap networks to ease global reserve pressure. But long-term, even they cannot forever play pressure release valve for world. Strong dollar no longer safety guarantee but symbol of unfair system. Core of every trade war not in tariffs or technology gaps. It lies in silent class wars within nations. When distribution distorted, people forced to tighten for elite accumulation, surplus deficit numbers only surface of deeper truth. To end trade wars, end domestic wars over who consumes, who sacrifices, who bears world's imbalances. Thank you for joining me to the story's final pages. Listening to a book is not just receiving information but experiencing ideas clashing with memories, worries, and hopes. I invite you to pause and reflect, does this book only talk about trade numbers, or does it touch individual lives, from jobs, wages, to feelings of security or fragility in society? Share your feelings, comments, even counter-arguments, they make this conversation truly valuable. If you have another book you'd like narrated, one that once troubled, confused, or simply intrigued you, suggest it. Your ideas open new journeys where I can continue decoding big ideas with you, perhaps even unspoken paradoxes. The most important lesson I carry from this book, surface battles, trade, politics, diplomacy, ultimately stem from hidden wars within societies. Who gets to benefit? Who sacrifices? Who bears the rest of the world's weight? Understanding that makes us less naive about simple promises and braver in facing root problems. Once again, thank you for your time. We will meet again in another book, another journey. See you soon, and I look forward to your thoughts after closing today's book.